I want to thank you for joining me during this Good Friday service, the day on which we remember the death of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. I wanted to share a couple of things with you very briefly today. A significant detail of our story is that it began in a garden where Jesus was arrested. And our story ultimately ended up being in yet another garden where the tomb was located, where Jesus' body was laid. There's a garden at the beginning, and there's a garden at the end. And at the end of the story, the stage is set for yet another occurrence within a garden. But that's to get ahead of myself a little bit. We'll be looking at that on Sunday. I want to take a look at this story that we have in the significance of the garden. But in order to do that, I want to take a couple steps back and consider where the biblical narrative, where the story of the Bible has already been, and the significance that bears on this crucifixion story. You know, when we look at the very beginning of the Bible, we find that God created our world. And this new creation was called good. Indeed, God looked at our world and said it was very good. And God made a man and a woman. He made Adam and Eve, and he put them in a garden. And in this garden, they could enjoy the fruit of the garden. And in the garden, there was the tree of life, and there was also the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And of course, we know the story of how Adam and Eve were told not to eat fruit from the knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and yet they did. And the consequences of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is that they would die. But the more immediate consequence was that they would be exiled from the Garden of Eden. So we have the story of God having a good creation, but we also have in that first narrative the invasion in our world of evil. So right from the very beginning of the Bible, we see a central problem in our world is the presence of evil. So right from the start, in order to get our world back to where it's supposed to be, we have to somehow, or somebody somehow, God somehow has to deal with that evil. He's got to run that evil out of our world. He's got to conquer that evil. He has to defeat that evil. Furthermore, in order to deal with what happened in the garden, he's got to do something about death. Death eventually finds us all. So God has to do something to overturn death. And as the story goes, we also saw Adam was exiled from the garden. And so part of the hope and dream of humanity is to one day be allowed to return to the garden. Of course, in order to return to the garden or live in creation as it was intended, first evil has to be defeated, death has to be done away with, and there has to be a return from exile. Now, as the story of the Bible goes along, there's a new hope for humanity found in this new people, a new people group, the people of Israel. But early on, we find that Israel is in a terrible catastrophe. You see, once again, humanity is in this state where they are exiled from the garden. And Israel is very much exiled from the garden. They find themselves in slavery in Egypt. And in this story, Egypt represents death. Egypt represents evil. Egypt is tyrannical. And Egypt enslaves the Israelites. And so God promises, and God someday has to deal with the reality of the slavery and the suffering of the Israelites. And so he, in order to set the Israelites free, Egypt must be decisively defeated. And evil, as represented by Egypt, must be defeated. And so the way the story goes, there's a series of plagues by which God systematically defeats the gods of Egypt, as it were. And the final plague involved the death of the firstborn, a final nail in the coffin, as it were, where God defeats the power of Egypt. We have this event which will ultimately result in Israel being emancipated from slavery. The other thing that happens on the night of the death of the firstborn, in which the firstborn sons of the Egyptians die, God instituted for the people of Israel the Passover festival. And on that night of the first Passover festival, there were lambs that were sacrificed, and the people smeared the blood of the lambs on the door. And as the night progressed and the firstborn of the Egyptians died, the Israelites were able to enjoy a feast and enjoy eating the meat from the lamb. And the outcome of this whole story is that Israel is finally emancipated from Egypt, and they're on their way to the Garden of Eden. Well, almost. This point is called the Promised Land, but the idea was for the people of Israel to be like Adam was in the garden, that they're going to go to this Promised Land, this wonderful place where they will be finally set free from evil, and they will get to worship God freely, a place in which evil will no longer be a problem, a place in which the exile from the garden will finally be undone. But the Israelites were not gone from Egypt very long before they found out that they did not leave evil behind in Egypt. No, they brought evil with them. This evil began to demonstrate itself very early as the Israelites were on their trip in the wilderness onto the Promised Land. Indeed, even as the Israelites were in the Promised Land, they committed horrific sins. They disregarded God and his covenant that he had made with the people. And eventually the story of Adam repeated itself. The Israelites who were in this new Garden of Eden, the Israelites who were in this Promised Land, were then exiled from their homeland because of their own evil. And so after that point, down through the ages, the dream, the goal was that Israel would no longer have to suffer from evil. They might overcome death. That they might be able to return to the Promised Land. And when Jesus began his ministry, while many of the Israelites got to live back in their homeland, they still found themselves in the midst of the story of Israel and the tyranny they faced in Egypt. Okay, it wasn't Pharaoh that they were dealing with any longer, but now it was Caesar from Rome. The story was much the same, and the people longed for a new Passover, a new, perhaps, series of plagues to befall the Romans, ultimately to culminate in the release of the Israelites from the terrible suffering they had dealt with under Rome. The problem, though, as we discovered back in the original Exodus, even if God defeated Rome, that wouldn't solve the dilemma that Israel had, that evil had permeated deep into Israel itself. So the Israelites longed for a new Passover. Evil needed to be dealt with. Death needed to be overcome. And they longed to return to the Promised Land, or to the Garden of Eden. Well, as we've looked at the stories in John all along, over and over again, John has been trying to tell us that in and through Jesus, creation was being born anew. There's a sense in which, by following Jesus, we get to return to the garden. There's a great exodus that was happening through the ministry of Jesus. But how was that going to come about? Remember the original Exodus? It involved the death of the firstborn, the death of the firstborn of the Egyptians, and also of the lamb giving its life on behalf of the Israelites. Well, on Good Friday, the Passover story was happening again. this time the firstborn son to give their life so that a new Exodus could happen was Jesus himself. This time, the lamb that had to be sacrificed for the Exodus story to happen was Jesus himself. And as we look at the entire story of what happens in chapters 18 and 19 of John, we find this contest between Jesus and the existing powers, whether it be the chief priest or the representative of Caesar himself, that is Pilate. We find Jesus doing battle with them, but in his way. And in the cross, we find the powers of evil exhausting themselves upon Jesus. In the way the early church understood the crucifixion, the way John understands the crucifixion, and the way that early church fathers understood the crucifixion, is that it was the event in which God conquered evil. Evil's power was finally defeated, finally dealt with. And so we find at the cross, evil's finally dealt with, so that a new possibility is opened for the people of God to return to the promised land, to return to the Garden of Eden. Or put another way, we find creation being renewed in and through the ministry of Jesus. And we'll find this much more vividly on Sunday morning. Jesus was that Passover lamb. Jesus is the death of the firstborn son. Jesus was the means by which Pharaoh was defeated, or in this case, Caesar was defeated. And even the powers behind Caesar, the prince of darkness, the prince of this world, is defeated at the cross, so that you and I could be set free from evil. Now, it might strike you as absurd that I'm suggesting evil in some way has been defeated. After all, when we look at our world today, we find that evil is still very prevalent. But there's a couple things I want to mention that might give you pause and help you to reconsider your evaluation of what happened at the cross. Two examples. Number one, when we look at earlier in the Bible, when we look at the story of David, we find that when David was a teenager, even before he faced Goliath, he was anointed by Samuel and declared to be Israel's new king. And yet, Saul continued to be king, or at least it appeared that way. But the reader knows that David is the legitimate king, and Saul is the illegitimate king. And it's only a matter of time before Saul is removed and David is exalted as king. And so, when did David become king? When he was anointed before he faced Goliath? Or does he become king after the death of Saul? Well, there's a sense in which both is true. But it is very true to say that David was king even before he faced Goliath. Another example for Americans. When did the United States become a free country, an independent country? Of course, we'll be quick to say, oh, well, that's July 4th, 1776. That's the day of the Declaration of Independence. We celebrate it with fireworks every year. Sure, there's a very real sense in which we became an independent people on July 4th. But that doesn't mean that the British soldiers all disappeared on that day. No, the Revolutionary War went on for quite some time after July 4th. In fact, it wasn't until September 3rd, 1783, that the Treaty of Paris was finally signed, ending the American Revolution. So when did the United States become an independent nation? Well, while on some level you could say, well, it wasn't independent until 1783 and the British soldiers finally left. And yet we celebrate it every year on July 4th because there's a very real sense in which we believe we became an independent people on that day. Jesus defeated evil on the cross. There is a sense in which Jesus will finish that work when he returns, and when death is finally defeated for all of us. But there is a very real sense in which evil was defeated on the day Jesus was crucified, and what has gone on in the interim is just the kind of mopping up job of finishing what Jesus already started. How does this look like in real life? Well, when an individual finally recognizes that Jesus is the world's rightful king and confesses their sins to Jesus, finds forgiveness in Jesus, and begins to obey him, in that person's life, evil is defeated. When communities that are torn, in which great conflict abounds, but the community turns toward Jesus and begins to seek him out and obeys his teaching, evil is overcome. The same can happen for nations. The same can happen for families. Because evil was defeated at the cross. This is the hope to which we hold. Jesus was the Passover lamb. The time of Exodus is now. We're on our way to a restored creation. We're on our way to the Garden of Eden. There's a hymn that was written by Charles Wesley that puts this idea very well. In his hymn called "'Tis Finished, the Messiah Dies," he wrote this: "The reign of sin and death is over, and all may live from sin set free. Satan has lost his mortal power. 'Tis swallowed up in victory